Blake sat in the living room, the TV on but ignored, as the early evening light streamed through the curtains. The day had been uneventful work, a quick dinner, and now the usual quietness of the house. He hadn't seen much of Kelly since she started working late nights, which had become more frequent in recent months. They'd barely spoke anymore, and the silence between them grew heavier each day. As he reached for the remote to change the channel, the front door creaked open loudly. Startled, Blake turned to see a massive figure filling the doorway. The man was well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and had an imposing presence that commanded attention. His face was rugged, with dark stubble that matched the intensity in his eyes. He walked in as if he owned the place, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. Without saying a word, the stranger strode into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed a beer. Blake watched, his confusion quickly turning to anger. Who was this guy, and why was he acting like he belonged here? But before Blake could speak, the man said, "Hey, loser." His voice was deep and dripping with condescension. "I'm taking your wife on a wild night out. She's mine now, and you can't stop it." Blake blinked. Trying to make sense of the words, they hit him like a slap to the face, knocking the wind out of him. "What the hell are you talking about?" he finally managed, his voice shaky. The man grinned, taking a long swig of the beer before tossing the cap onto the counter. "Don't worry," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "I'll make sure she has more fun than she ever did with you." The taunt hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Blake felt his blood boil, his fists clenching involuntarily. He wanted to lunge at the man, to wipe that smug look off his face, but something held him back. It wasn't fear, no, it was something deeper, a mix of shock and a growing realization that this wasn't just some sick joke. Before Blake could react further, he heard footsteps on the stairs. He turned and saw Kelly coming down slowly, almost like she was on a runway. She wore a tight, short red dress he had never seen before, and her hair was styled with makeup more dramatic than usual. But what struck him most was her expression, a smirk that was equal parts excitement and disdain. "Kelly, what the __ is going on?" Blake's voice was barely a whisper, tinged with a desperation he hadn't felt in years. She paused halfway down the stairs, smirking at him like he was pathetic. "Today's going to be so much fun," she said lightly, almost playfully. "I'm leaving, honey. We'll be back before breakfast if you're lucky." She reached the bottom of the stairs and walked over to the man, sliding her arm around his waist. He pulled her close, his hand settling possessively on her hip. The sight of them together hit Blake like a punch to the gut. This was his wife, the woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with, and now she was wrapped around another man, acting like Blake didn't even exist. "What the hell are you doing?" Kelly. Blake's voice cracked with emotion, but she didn't flinch. If anything, her smirk deepened. "Don't wait up," she said coldly, her eyes devoid of any affection. "And don't bother calling. We're going to places you wouldn't understand." The man laughed, a low, rumbling sound that made Blake's skin crawl. "Let's go, babe," he said, turning toward the door. "We've got a long night ahead." As they walked out, Kelly didn't look back. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Blake standing in the middle of the living room, his world collapsing around him. The laughter he heard outside was like nails on a chalkboard, each sound a painful reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. Blake felt the walls closing in, his breathing shallow and rapid, but as the minutes passed, something in him changed. The panic began to fade, replaced by a cold, hard determination. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about something deeper, something that had been festering for a long time. He didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Blake stood motionless, the slam of the front door still echoing in his ears. The house felt emptier than it had in years, as if Kelly's departure had drained the life from it. He turned slowly, his eyes landing on the clock above the mantel. The ticking was loud, each second passing with a deliberate, taunting rhythm. He glanced at the couch where they used to sit together. The silence that was once comfortable now felt suffocating. His gaze drifted to the window. He crossed the room, pushing aside the curtain with a trembling hand. Outside, he saw the man's sleek black car parked in the driveway. Kelly was already seated in the passenger seat. She didn't look back, not once. The car's engine roared to life, and they were gone, the taillights disappearing down the street like a fading dream. Blake let the curtain fall back into place and turned away from the window. He felt a hollowness in his chest, a deep, gnawing ache that had nothing to do with love lost and everything to do with betrayal. The image of Kelly in that dress, clinging to another man, was burned into his mind. He moved to the kitchen, his steps heavy and uncertain. The remnants of their dinner still sat on the table, untouched. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his hands gripping the edge of the table, as if it could anchor him to reality. His mind, however, was slipping, sliding back into memories he had tried to bury. He remembered when they first met, how Kelly's laugh had been infectious, how they talked for hours about everything and nothing. They had dreams back then, traveling the world, starting a family, growing old together. But somewhere along the line, those dreams had withered, replaced by routine and complacency. The passion that once burned so brightly between them had faded, replaced by a cold, distant politeness that neither of them dared to confront. Blake stared at the empty chair across from him, where Kelly used to sit. The sound of her voice, once a source of comfort, now echoed in his mind like a taunt, "We'll be back before breakfast, if you're lucky." The words repeated themselves over and over, each repetition driving the knife deeper into his gut. He pushed the chair back abruptly and stood up. The room was too small, too confining. He needed to move, to do something, anything, to stop the relentless flood of memories and regrets. He paced the kitchen, his thoughts racing, circling back to the same question: how had it come to this? How had he let things slip so far? He knew the answer, of course. He had let the grind of daily life consume him, the late nights at work, the endless bills, the stress of making ends meet. He had lost himself in all of it, and in losing himself he had lost her too. But self-blame quickly turned into something darker. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Kelly had made her choice. She had chosen to leave, to betray everything they had built together for the thrill of something new. She had chosen someone else, someone who made her feel alive in a way he hadn't been able to in years. Blake's pacing slowed as his thoughts crystallized. The pain, the sorrow, it all began to twist into something harder, something colder. The humiliation he felt, the image of Kelly with that man, it all demanded a response. But not just any response, it needed to be something more, something that would cut as deep as the wound she had inflicted on him. Blake walked to the sink and turned on the faucet, letting the cold water run over his hands. The sensation grounded him, bringing a clarity that had been missing since the moment that man had entered his home. Blake stared out the kitchen window, watching as the night settled in, the darkness deepening with each passing minute. His mind was no longer racing, it was focused, intent on a single thought: revenge. But this wasn't the kind of revenge involving yelling or fighting. No, this had to be more calculated, something that would shake them to their core. It had to be something that would haunt them, just as their betrayal haunted him now. Blake dried his hands and walked out of the kitchen, his movements deliberate. He headed down the hallway to the spare room, his office. It was cluttered with papers, bills, and remnants of the life he had tried to build. He ignored the mess, pulling open the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a small lockbox. He hadn't opened it in years, not since his father passed away. He found the key hidden under a stack of old receipts and unlocked the box. Inside, among old photographs and keepsakes, was a small handgun. It was something he had kept out of necessity, never out of desire. Blake lifted the gun out of the box, feeling its weight in his hand. He wasn't a violent man. He had never been in a real fight in his life. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't the man he used to be. He had been pushed too far, and something inside him had snapped. He stood there in the dim light of the room, the gun in his hand, and made a decision. The old Blake was gone, buried under the weight of betrayal and heartbreak. What remained was someone who wasn't going to sit quietly and let this happen. He was going to make sure that Kelly and her lover understood the full extent of what they had done. Blake put the gun back in the box, locked it, and placed it back in the drawer. He wasn't sure when or how he would use it, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. He moved with a purpose that was almost clinical, his mind detached from the emotions roiling beneath the surface. The night stretched on, silent and oppressive, but he barely noticed. His focus was razor-sharp, his actions deliberate. He wasn't a man of violence, not naturally, but desperation had a way of transforming even the most mild-mannered into something else, something colder, more calculated. He began by picking up Kelly's phone, which she had carelessly left charging on the kitchen counter. He unlocked it easily after years together. Her passcode was no mystery to him. Within minutes, he had installed a tracking app, something simple but effective. He knew she wouldn't notice, it would run quietly in the background, unseen. He smiled grimly at the thought she'd never been much for technology anyway. Next, he turned his attention to the stranger, the man who had boldly walked into his home, taken his beer, and claimed his wife. Blake had memorized the guy's license plate as they drove away. It was a small detail, but it was enough. He knew people who could dig up information, no questions asked, as long as the price was right. Blake wasn't wealthy, but he had enough savings to make this work. A quick phone call to an old acquaintance, some cash transferred, and within hours he had the man's name, address, and more. The next step was the basement, a space that Kelly had always avoided: too cold, too dark, too musty. She had never liked it, which suited Blake just fine. It gave him a place to think, to work, and now to prepare. The basement was already filled with tools, remnants of his various home improvement projects, but he needed more. He made a quick trip to the 24-hour hardware store, picking up items that felt oddly mundane considering what he intended to use them for: chains, a heavy tarp, duct tape. He paid in cash, not wanting to leave a trail. The cashier didn't even glance up, appearing too bored or tired to care. Back home, Blake carefully organized everything in the basement, arranging the tools with a precision that bordered on obsession. He tested the chains, ensuring they were strong enough, and secured them to the heavy beams lining the ceiling. The tarp was spread across the floor, and the duct tape was within easy reach. Everything had to be perfect. There was no room for mistakes. As he worked, his mind kept drifting back to the scene from earlier that evening, the way they had laughed as they walked out the door. Kelly clinging to that man, as if Blake didn't exist. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the ease with which they had dismissed him, as if all those years together had meant nothing. They thought they were invincible, that they could trample over him without any consequences, but they were wrong. Blake was going to show them just how mistaken they were. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the basement's small window, Blake was ready. He climbed the stairs to the main floor, pausing at the top to listen. The house was still, empty, the bed upstairs untouched. He had spent the entire night preparing, and now, with the sun rising, all that was left was to wait. He made himself a pot of coffee, the simple act momentarily grounding him. The familiar smell filled the kitchen, a stark contrast to the dark thoughts swirling in his mind. He poured a cup, black and strong, and took it to the living room, sitting in his usual chair. The TV was still on, playing a rerun of some old sitcom, but Blake wasn't paying attention. His mind was miles away, focused on what was to come. Kelly and her lover would return eventually, thinking they could just walk back into the house as if nothing had happened. But when they did, they would find a different Blake waiting, not the passive, quiet man they had brushed aside so easily, but someone else, someone who had spent the night carefully planning their downfall. As he sipped his coffee, Blake felt a strange calm wash over him. He wasn't afraid of what he was about to do. In fact, it felt inevitable, like the natural outcome of everything that had happened. They had made their choices, and now he was making his. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each one bringing him closer to the moment when they would return and his plan would be put into action. Blake finished his coffee, set the cup on the table, and leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. It didn't matter, he had all the time in the world, and when the moment arrived, he would be ready. Blake had been waiting for this, his senses sharp, his emotions locked behind a wall of cold determination. As the black car pulled into the driveway, the first light of dawn cast long shadows across the yard. He heard the engine turn off and the sound of car doors opening. The night had been long, but he felt no exhaustion instead. A strange calmness had settled over him, like the stillness before a storm. The front door creaked open, and the stranger swaggered in first, his footsteps heavy, followed by Kelly, who seemed to float beside him, still caught in the afterglow of their night out. Their laughter filled the entryway, but stopped abruptly when they stepped into the kitchen and saw Blake sitting at the table, casually sipping his coffee as if it were any other day. "Good morning, guys," Blake said, his voice steady, almost cheerful. He looked up from his cup, meeting their shocked stares with a calm that was unsettling. "How was your night?" Kelly froze, her smirk fading as she searched his face for something familiar, something to reassure her that everything was still under control. But instead, she found a man she no longer recognized, someone completely different from the passive husband she had taken for granted. The stranger, still full of his own arrogance, scoffed. "What's with the look, loser?" He sneered, stepping forward. "Didn't get enough sleep." Blake didn't respond. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with a soft clink that echoed in the tense silence. The stranger, mistaking Blake's calm for weakness, smirked and stepped closer, his swagger undiminished. But in an instant, Blake sprang into action. His fist shot out, connecting with the stranger's jaw with a force that sent him stumbling backward. The sound of the impact was sharp, followed by the dull thud of the man hitting the floor, his arrogance shattered along with his jaw. Kelly screamed in pure shock, but the sound was cut off as Blake turned to her, his eyes cold and unforgiving. She backed away instinctively, trying to put distance between them, her earlier confidence fading in the face of this new, dangerous Blake. "Blake, what the hell are you doing?" she stammered, her voice shaking. This wasn't the man she expected to find, not the one she had left behind just hours earlier. Blake took a step toward her, his expression unreadable. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice low and threatening. He glanced at the stranger, who was groaning on the floor, clutching his injured jaw. Both of you. Kelly looked from Blake to the man on the ground, her mind racing. "Blake, please, you don't have to do this. Let's just talk." "No," Blake interrupted, his voice firm. "We're done talking. You made your choice. Now it's my turn." He moved swiftly, grabbing the stranger by the collar and pulling him to his feet. The man tried to resist, but the hit to his jaw had left him dizzy and sluggish. Blake shoved him toward the door, then turned to Kelly, who stood frozen, fear etched on her face. "Blake, please," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "Shut up," Blake snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I don't want your apologies. I want you to understand what you've done." He grabbed her arm not roughly, but firmly enough that she knew resisting was pointless. With the stranger stumbling ahead of them, Blake led the way down the hall toward the basement door. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest as they descended the stairs, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. This wasn't a nightmare. She could wake up from. This was real, and Blake was serious. The basement was dimly lit, the shadows long and threatening. Blake shoved the stranger into a chair he had prepared earlier, securing him with chains that had once been used for mundane projects, but now had a darker purpose. The man groaned, still dazed, as Blake tightened. The moment everything would change had arrived. He turned to Kelly, who was staring at him with wide eyes, a mix of fear and disbelief in her expression. "You wanted excitement," Blake said, his voice soft, almost sad. "Well, here it is." The basement was cold and old, the air thick with tension. Kelly, tied to a chair in the middle of the room, shivered uncontrollably. The chains clinked as the stranger pulled at them, his movements desperate and frantic. He had fully woken up to the seriousness of his situation and was now painfully aware of the danger he was in. Blake stood before them, the dim light bulb casting long, eerie shadows that flickered with every movement. Blake held a knife in his hand, its blade reflecting the harsh overhead light. He looked at the stranger and then at Kelly, his expression impossible to read. "You thought you could just waltz into my life, take what's mine, and walk away," Blake said, his voice calm but edged with quiet fury. "You thought there wouldn't be consequences." The stranger tried to speak, but the duct tape over his mouth muffled his words. He thrashed against the chains, his eyes wide with fear, trying to plead with his gaze. Blake stepped closer, moving deliberately. He brought the knife down slowly, making the first cut a shallow, precise line across the man's chest. The blade sliced through the fabric of his shirt, leaving a thin red line of blood. The stranger's muffled scream echoed in the confined space, a sound that seemed to fulfill Blake's need for revenge. "This is just the beginning," Blake said, his voice low but clear. He turned his gaze to Kelly, who was watching with horrified eyes. "You both betrayed me, and now you're going to pay." Blake walked over to Kelly, the knife still glinting in his hand. She flinched as he approached, her eyes darting between the knife and the man on the floor. "You chose him over me," Blake whispered, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "You made a choice, and now you're going to watch him suffer." Kelly's tears flowed, her face flushed with fear. "Blake, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. We can talk." Blake cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No more talking," he said firmly. He turned his attention back to the stranger, who was now gasping through his nose, his body shaking. Blake knelt beside him, examining the cut he had made. "You think this is bad?" he asked, his voice icy. "You have no idea what's coming next." He stood up and walked over to the workbench, where he had arranged a few tools, earlier pliers, a hammer, and some heavy-duty wire. He picked up the pliers, holding them up so the stranger could see them. The man's eyes widened in panic as he realized what they were for. Blake turned back to Kelly, who was crying softly. "You wanted excitement," he said, his voice almost gentle but laced with menace. "Well, this is what it looks like." He approached the stranger again, his face set in a grim expression. Using the pliers, he gripped the edge of the cut, squeezing just enough to make the stranger writhe in pain. The man's muffled cries grew louder, but the duct tape still stifled them. Blake's hands were steady, his movements precise as he applied pressure. Kelly watched in horror, her sobs mingling with the stranger's muffled screams. "Blake, please stop," she begged, her voice barely audible. "This isn't you. We can work this out. I'll do anything." Blake ignored her, his focus entirely on the stranger now. He released the pliers and picked up the hammer, raising it slowly, letting the suspense build before bringing it down with a sharp, decisive motion. The blow landed on the floor beside the stranger, but the sound was enough to make him flinch violently. Blake set the hammer back down and walked over to Kelly, crouching in front of her. "Do you see what you've done?" he asked, his voice low but intense. "You chose him. Now you have to watch him suffer. This is your fault." Kelly shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Blake, please," she whispered. "I'm begging you, let him go. He's just a guy." "This is insane." Blake's expression grew colder. "Insane," he repeated, standing up. "You think this is insane? You think what you did was just a mistake? This is reality, Kelly. This is what happens when you cross me." He turned back to the stranger, who was now sobbing quietly, his body trembling with every painful breath. Blake reached for the knife again, its blade shining ominously, and made another cut, this time a bit deeper, drawing another scream from the man. Blake faced Kelly once more, his face set in a determined scowl. "This is your nightmare," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl, "and it's only just beginning." The basement fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Kelly's sobs and the stranger's painful gasps. Blake stood over them, his emotions a chaotic mix of anger, satisfaction, and something darker, more primal. He knew this was just the beginning of what he had planned. The real nightmare was only starting. Hours had passed, but time felt meaningless. The man on the floor, who had once been so arrogant, was now barely conscious. His body lay limp, his cries reduced to weak whimpers. Kelly sat tied to the chair, her face empty of emotion, her eyes staring blankly into the distance, as if her mind had escaped to a place far away from the horror unfolding around her. Blake stood over them, the knife still clenched in his hand, its blade slick with blood. His breathing was ragged, each breath coming in heavy, uneven gasps. He had imagined this moment countless times, thinking it would bring him closure or satisfaction. But now, standing in the aftermath of his rage, he felt a deep emptiness. The anger that had driven him had faded, leaving behind a hollow void. He looked down at the knife, the metal catching the dim basement light. For a moment, a wave of nausea hit him as the harsh reality of what he had done and what he had become crashed over him. The anger that once felt so justified now seemed foreign and meaningless. Blake dropped the knife, the clang of metal against concrete sounding like a judgment. The knife rolled a few feet away, coming to rest against the wall. The sound of it falling was stark and final, echoing through the basement and breaking the heavy silence. "I thought this would make me feel better," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought it would be enough to see you suffer, but now all I feel is emptiness." Kelly blinked, her eyes briefly meeting his for the first time. Tears filled her eyes, but she stayed silent. She had no words, no excuses that could cut through the haze of Blake's disillusionment. Blake stood up suddenly, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on his shoulders. Without saying another word, he turned and walked toward the basement stairs, the sound of his footsteps a sharp contrast to the stillness of the basement. Each step felt like he was moving away from the person he once was and toward an uncertain future. He climbed the stairs slowly, the creaking steps the only noise in the otherwise silent house. At the top of the stairs he paused, looking back down into the basement. The door loomed in front of him, a threshold between the life he had known and whatever lay ahead. As he reached for the door handle, Blake took one last look at the basement and at the two people who had once been part of his life, but now symbolized everything he wanted to leave behind. The door closed with a soft click, sealing off the sight and sounds from below. Blake leaned against the door for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't know what would come next or which path he would take, but he knew one thing: this was the end of a chapter. The finality of the door closing behind him felt symbolic. He moved through the house, each room feeling like a ghost of his former life. The walls seemed to close in, heavy with memories and regrets. He walked out into the morning light, the world outside starkly different from the darkness he had just left. The sun was rising, casting a new light on everything. Blake took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. He felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Leaving Kelly and the stranger behind, he was free from the immediate consequences of his actions, but he also faced the daunting reality of what lay ahead. As he walked away from the house, Blake realized that sometimes the most brutal revenge isn't in the act itself, but in recognizing its futility. The true horror was understanding that the pain and destruction weren't a resolution, but the start of something even more unsettling. He had hoped for closure, but was left with the harsh truth that some wounds never heal, and some paths, once taken, lead to a darkness that's impossible to escape. Days turned into weeks, and the silence that followed the night of violence was oppressive. Blake moved out of the house, packing his belongings with a mechanical precision. He had already filed for divorce before leaving, making sure everything was as impersonal as possible. The house, once a symbol of a shared life, now felt like a relic of a past he wanted to leave behind. Blake's departure was abrupt. He didn't tell Kelly he was leaving. He simply packed his bags, took a final look at the life he was abandoning, and walked out. Determined to sever every tie to his old life, he left the city where he had lived for years and settled into a new place, a small apartment in an unfamiliar town. He adopted a new identity, one that allowed him to blend into the crowd, to be anyone but himself. Meanwhile, Kelly and her lover were left to deal with the consequences of their choices. The once lively home was now filled with strange silence and broken dreams. The stranger had been released from the hospital, but the physical and emotional scars of that night left him a shadow of his former self. His bravado was gone, replaced by a shell-shocked demeanor that matched Kelly's own sense of despair. The couple's interactions were strained, filled with guilt and fear. They avoided discussing the events of that night, hoping that silence would somehow make it less real, but the guilt clung to them, a constant reminder of the price they had paid. Their relationship, once driven by passion and excitement, was now haunted by regret, making every moment feel like a punishment. Kelly would often sit alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the space where Blake's presence had once been. The house, now too quiet, seemed to amplify her thoughts. The empty spaces where Blake's things used to be served as constant reminders of the life she had ruined. She tried to focus on rebuilding her life, but every effort felt hollow. She would find herself replaying the events of that night, each memory reopening the wounds. Her lover, meanwhile, battled his own demons. Blake, on the other hand, found comfort in his new anonymity. The busy city streets and unfamiliar faces seemed to offer a kind of freedom he had never known before. He threw himself into his new life, taking a new job and establishing a new routine. The memories of his past life started to fade with time, becoming distant echoes rather than an ongoing reality. The decision to leave them behind, to walk away from the confrontation and the pain, brought Blake an unexpected peace. In the quiet of his new apartment, he found comfort in the simplicity of a life free from the burdens of the past. He realized that true revenge wasn't in the actions he had taken, but in the power he had reclaimed by choosing to live differently, free from the chains of his former existence. As the months went by, Blake adjusted to this new chapter. He regained a sense of control over his life, something that had been missing for years. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully escape the shadows of his past, but he knew he had made a choice that allowed him to move forward, finding a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Meanwhile, Kelly and her lover continued to live with the aftermath of their decisions. The past couldn't be undone, and the weight of their choices was something they would always carry. The silent punishment they endured served as a constant reminder of the decisions they had made, casting a shadow over their efforts to rebuild their lives. Blake now understood that the most profound form of revenge wasn't in causing suffering, but in choosing a different path, one that allowed him to reclaim his sense of self. In that choice, he found a kind of freedom, a peace that eluded those who remained trapped in the aftermath of their actions.